The scissors made soft clicking sounds as David Miller cut another customer's hair. Outside his small shop window, the twin suns of Haven's Rest were setting behind the colony's protective walls. Red and orange light painted the street in warm colors. David had been cutting hair for 23 years, first on Earth and now on this distant world. His hands moved without thinking, trimming and shaping while his mind wandered. Mrs. Patterson sat in his chair, talking about her vegetable garden and how the alien soil made her tomatoes taste different. David nodded and made small sounds to show he was listening, but part of him was already thinking about the field. Every evening when the last customer left and he cleaned his tools, David walked outside the colony walls to a place where golden grass grew as far as the eye could. "See? All done," David said, brushing loose hair from Mrs. Patterson's shoulders. She paid him with colony credits and left with a smile. David swept the floor and put his scissors away. The shop felt too small suddenly, like it always did at the end of the day. He needed space and fresh air, and the feeling of being somewhere, bigger than four walls. David locked his shop and walked down Main Street. The colony was small, just 5,000 people who had come here to farm and mine and start new lives. Most of them stayed inside the walls after dark, afraid of what might live in the wilderness. But David had walked these fields for months and never seen anything dangerous. Just grass and small animals and the endless sky. He reached the main gate where two guards stood watch. They knew him by now and waved as he passed through. "Evening, David," called Guard Wilson. "Off to your field again? Just need some quiet time," David replied, which was true, but not the whole truth. The real truth was harder to explain. David went to the field to sing, not because anyone asked him to or because he was particularly good at it. He sang because his grandmother had taught him songs when he was small, and those songs felt like home in a way nothing else did. On this alien world, surrounded by strange plants and unfamiliar stars, singing made him feel connected to something larger than himself. David walked for 10 minutes until the colony's lights faded behind him. The field stretched out under the night sky, peaceful and empty. 2 moons hung overhead, one silver and one pale blue. They cast enough light to see by, turning the grass into waves of shadow and brightness. In the center of the field stood an old tree stump, probably from when the colonists first cleared this land. David had been sitting on this same stump every night for 6 months. It was the perfect height and just the right distance from everything else. Far enough from the colony that no one would hear him, but close enough that he could see the lights, if he needed to find his way back. David sat down and looked up at the stars. Some of them were the same ones he had known on Earth. Others were completely new. He wondered what his grandmother would think of this place, this field under alien moons where her grandson came to sing her songs. He started with a lullaby she used to hum while cooking dinner. The melody was simple and sad and beautiful. His voice carried across the empty grass, mixing with the sound of wind and the distant calls of nightbirds. David closed his eyes and let the music flow out of him. Next came a working song about planting seeds and watching them grow, then a love song about missing someone far away. David's voice was not trained or perfect, but it was honest. Each note came from somewhere deep inside him, carrying feelings he could not put into words. As he sang, David felt the loneliness that followed him everywhere begin to fade. The field listened without judgment. The grass moved in the wind like it was dancing to his music. Even the moons seemed to shine a little brighter. David had no idea that something else was listening too. Far beyond the field, in the mountain, caves where shadows grew thick and deep, an ancient creature stirred. Sireth had been sleeping when the strange sound reached her sensitive ears. At first she thought it might be some new kind of prey animal, but the sound was too complex, too purposeful. It had patterns and emotions that no simple beast could make. Sireth had lived in these mountains for over 1,000 years. She remembered when this world had no human colonies, no cities, no farms. She remembered when her own people filled the skies, their songs echoing between the stars. But that was long ago, before the hunting, before the dying, before the terrible silence that followed. Now there were only humans on this world, and humans meant danger. They always did. Sireth had learned to stay hidden, to avoid their settlements, to hunt only at night in places where they never went. She had watched their colony grow from nothing to its current size, always keeping her distance. But this sound was different from anything humans had made before. It was not the noise of their machines or the chatter of their voices. It was something else entirely, something that made old memories stir in the deepest parts of her mind. Cyrith lifted her great head and listened more carefully. The sound came from the direction of the human settlement, but not from inside their walls. It was out in the open, unprotected, and alone. One voice, singing into the darkness. The melody was nothing like the songs Cyrith's people had once sung, but it carried the same feeling, longing and beauty and the need to share something precious with the world. Cyrith had not heard anything like it since the last of her kind had fallen silent centuries ago. Night after night, the singing continued. Cyrith found herself moving, closer to the edge of her territory, drawn by curiosity and something deeper she could not name. The human always came to the same place at the same time, always sang the same kinds of songs. There was a routine to it, a ritual that spoke of deep loneliness and deeper hope. Cyrith began to remember what it felt like to have music in her life. Before the fear, before the hiding, when songs filled the air like breathing. The human's voice was small and fragile compared to the mighty chorus her people had once raised, but it carried the same essential truth. Music was not just sound, it was the sharing of souls across the darkness, and Cyrith, who had been alone longer than most civilizations had existed, found herself wanting to answer. Rain fell softly on Haven's Rest, drumming against David's shop window as he finished cleaning his tools. The weather had been strange all week, with thick clouds rolling in from the eastern mountains. Most of his customers had canceled their appointments, choosing to stay home where it was warm and dry. David did not mind the rain. It gave the world a clean smell and made the colors brighter. As he locked up his shop, he wondered if he should skip his evening walk to the field. The thought lasted only a moment before he dismissed it. Rain or shine, hot or cold, David had not missed a single night in 7 months. The field was waiting, for him, and so were the songs his grandmother had taught him. He pulled on his weather coat and stepped out into the drizzle. The streets were empty except for a few colonists hurrying between buildings. David walked slowly, enjoying the feel of cool water on his face. By the time he reached the main gate, his hair was damp and his boots were muddy. "Nasty night for a walk," said Guard Chen, huddling under the gate's metal roof. "Every night's a good night for what I do out there," David replied with a smile. The field looked different in the rain. The grass was darker, almost black in some places, and the 2 moons were hidden behind thick clouds. Only the colony's distant lights provided any visibility. David made his way carefully to his usual stump, feeling the wet earth squelch beneath his feet. He sat down and looked around at the transformed landscape. Everything seemed more mysterious in the rain, more alive somehow. Water dripped from his coat and hair, but David barely noticed. He was already thinking about which songs to sing tonight. He started with something slow and gentle, a melody that matched the rhythm of the falling rain. His voice mixed with the sound of water hitting, grass and distant thunder rolling through the mountains. The song was about rivers and oceans and all the places water could take you if you were brave enough to follow. As David sang, he felt the familiar peace that came with being alone in the field. All the small worries of daily life faded away. There was only the music and the rain and the vast darkness that surrounded him like a blanket. But tonight was different. As David finished his second song and began a third, he heard something that made him stop mid-note. A sound came from somewhere, beyond the field's edge, low and deep and almost musical. It was not thunder, which would have been sharp and sudden. The sound rolled on, rising and falling like a voice trying to find a melody. David sat perfectly still, listening with every part of his being. The sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely not a natural noise. Something was out there in the darkness, something that was responding to his singing. Fear touched David's heart for a moment. He was alone in an empty field on an alien world, with no weapon except a small knife he used to trim hair. Whatever was making that sound could probably kill him without much effort. The smart thing would be to run back to the colony as fast as his legs could carry him. But David did not run. Something in the quality of that sound held him in place. It was not threatening or angry. If anything, it sounded sad and lonely, like an echo of his own feelings reflected back from the darkness. "Hello?" David called out, his voice small against the rain and wind. "Is someone there?" Silence answered him. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the sound came again. Closer still, and now David could hear something like intelligence in it. Not human intelligence, but awareness nonetheless. Something was listening to him, considering him, trying to decide what to do about this strange human who sang alone. In the rain, David's heart pounded, but he stayed seated on his stump. "I won't hurt you," he said to the darkness. "I'm just here to sing. That's all I ever do out here." A shadow moved at the edge of his vision, huge and impossible. David turned his head slowly, afraid to make any sudden movements. At first he saw nothing but rain and grass. Then lightning flickered in the distance, and for one brief moment the entire field was lit up like day. David saw her then. Cyrith stood perhaps 50 yards away, her massive form partially hidden behind a small hill. She was bigger than any living thing David had ever imagined, with scales that caught the lightning and threw it back in colors that had no names. Her wings were folded against her sides, but even so, she seemed to fill the entire horizon. Her eyes were the size of dinner plates, ancient and intelligent and filled with centuries of sorrow. A dragon. A real dragon, not from stories or movies, but standing right there in his field. David should have been terrified. Every instinct told him to scream, to run, to call for help. Instead, he found himself staring at the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. "You're magnificent," David whispered. Cyrith heard the words, understood them through her translator implant, and felt something shift inside her chest. In all her long life, no human had ever looked at her without fear or greed in their eyes. They saw her scales and thought of starship fuel. They saw her size and thought of conquest. They saw her fire and thought of destruction. But this small human, sitting alone in the rain with water dripping from his hair, looked at her and saw beauty. Cyrith took a careful step closer, her massive claws sinking into the muddy ground. David did not move away. He sat on his stump like a statue, watching her approach with wonder instead of terror. When she was close enough that he could have touched her if he reached out, Cyrith lowered her great head until they were looking directly at each other. "You sing," she said in the universal language, her voice like distant thunder. "Yes," David replied. "Do you?" Cyrith's eyes widened. No one had asked her that question in over 1,000 years. She tried to remember the last time she had made music instead of just noise. It had been with her mate and children before the hunters came, before the ending of everything she had loved. "I used to," she said finally. David smiled, and something warm spread through Cyrith's chest. "Would you like to try again? I could teach you some songs. Human songs are simple, but they're beautiful in their own way." Cyrith stared at this impossible human who offered friendship instead of running away. She thought of all the centuries she had spent alone in the mountains, all the nights she had listened to his singing and remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." And so, in a field on an alien world, while rain fell softly around them, a human barber and the last dragon of Haven's Rest began the most unlikely friendship in the history of either species. 3 weeks had passed since that first meeting in the rain, and David's evening routine had completely changed. He still closed his barbershop at sunset and walked to the field, but now he was never alone. Cyrith waited for him every night, her massive form becoming as familiar as the old tree stump where he sat. Tonight the weather was clear and warm. Both moons shone full overhead, casting silver light across the grass. David arrived to find Cyrith already there, her scales shimmering like captured starlight. She had arranged herself in a comfortable position, her great head resting on her front leg so she could look at David without towering over him. "Good evening, my friend," David said as he settled onto his stump. "Good evening, David," Cyrith replied. Her voice had grown softer over the weeks as she became more comfortable with speaking. The universal translator she wore allowed them to understand each other, though sometimes the meaning got lost between languages. David had learned much about Cyrith during their time together. She was old beyond human understanding, having lived for over 15 centuries. She remembered when this world had different weather patterns, when the mountains were shaped differently, when entirely different species lived in the forests and plains. Most importantly, she remembered when she was not alone. "Will you tell me about your family again?" David asked gently. "Only if you want to." Cyrith's eyes grew distant, looking not at David but through him to memories from long ago. Their names were Catherine and Velith, my mate and our daughter. We lived in the high peaks where the air is thin and the stars feel close enough to touch. David listened without interrupting. He had heard pieces of this story before, but Cyrith seemed to need to tell it again and again, as if sharing the memories kept them alive. Catherine's voice could shake mountains when he sang the old songs, deep notes that traveled for miles, calling other dragons to join the evening chorus. Velith was learning to harmonize with us. Her voice was still small then, like silver bells mixing with our thunder. Cyrith paused, and David could see pain flickering in her ancient eyes. The hunters came from beyond the sky in ships we had never seen before. They told us they needed our scales to power their vessels to travel between stars. We tried to explain that our scales were part of us, that taking them meant death. They said they understood, but they needed them anyway. David felt anger burning in his chest. He had heard stories about the old Galactic Empire, about how they had stripped entire worlds of resources without caring what they destroyed. But hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the stories real in a way that hurt. Catherine fought them to protect Velith and me. He was so strong, so brave. But their weapons were not like anything we knew. They turned his own fire back against him, trapped him in nets made of light. I tried to help him, but there were too many ships, too many weapons. Cyrith's voice broke slightly, and David reached out to touch one of her massive claws. The gesture was tiny, meaningless, compared to her size, but she seemed to appreciate it. They took his scales while he still lived. I had to watch. Then they came for Velith. She was so young, so frightened. She called for me as they dragged her away, but I could not reach her in time. David felt tears running down his face. He had never heard a story so heartbreaking, never seen pain so deep and lasting. I escaped only because Catherine's final act was to bring down one of their ships. In the chaos, I fled to these mountains and hid. I have been hiding ever since. How long has it been? David asked quietly. 1,217 years, Cyrith replied immediately. I count every day. They sat in silence for a long moment, sharing the weight of that impossible span of time. David tried to imagine being alone for over 1,000 years, carrying that grief without anyone to share it with. He could barely comprehend such loneliness. Is that why you stopped singing? David asked. There was no one left to sing with, Cyrith said simply. Songs are meant to be shared. Alone they are just noise. David understood. His own singing had been a solitary act until Cyrith arrived, but even so he had always imagined his grandmother, listening or hoped that someone might hear and be moved by the music. To sing with no hope of connection at all would be unbearable. Would you like to try singing now? David asked. One of the songs your family used to sing? Cyrith considered this. Over the past weeks, David had taught her several human songs, simple melodies that her deep voice could manage, but she had not attempted any of the old dragon songs since her family died. I do not remember them well, she said hesitantly. It has been so long. That's okay, David assured her. Just try whatever comes to you. I'll listen. Cyrith lifted her great head toward the moons and took a breath that seemed to fill her entire body. When she opened her mouth, the sound that emerged was unlike anything David had ever heard. It was deeper than thunder, richer than the ocean, more complex than any human voice could ever be. The notes rose and fell in patterns that spoke of vast distances and ancient wisdom. But there were gaps in the melody where other voices should have joined in. Places where Catherine's bass notes would have supported her soaring tones, where Velith's bright harmonies would have danced around the main theme. The song was beautiful, but it was also heartbreakingly incomplete. When Cyrith finished, she lowered her head and looked at David with eyes full of sorrow. "It sounds wrong without them," she said. "Empty." David thought for a moment, then began to hum softly. He could not match the complexity of Cyrith's song, but he could find simple notes that fit with her melody. When she looked at him in surprise, he smiled. "I can't sing like a dragon," David said, "but maybe I can fill some of the empty spaces, just until you remember how the whole song goes." Cyrith stared at him in wonder. This small human with his limited voice was offering to help carry a song that was older than his entire species. It should have been impossible, ridiculous even. Dragon songs were not meant for human throats. But when Cyrith began to sing again and David joined in with his simple harmonies, something magical happened. The ancient melody came alive in a new way, different from how it had sounded with her family, but beautiful nonetheless. David's human voice added something unexpected to the dragon song, a warmth and intimacy that complemented Cyrith's power and majesty. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Cyrith was not singing alone. As their voices blended together under the twin moons, other sounds joined them. Night birds added their calls, wind rustled through the grass in rhythm with the music, and even the distant lights of the human colony seemed to twinkle in time with the melody. When the song finally ended, both David and Cyrith were crying. But these were not tears of sorrow like the ones they had shed while sharing painful memories. These were tears of joy, of connection, of the incredible discovery that even the deepest loneliness could be healed with the right kind of friendship. "Thank you," Cyrith whispered. "Thank you," David replied, and in that moment both of them knew that something had changed forever. They were no longer just a human and a dragon who happened to meet in a field. They were family, bound together by music and understanding and the simple miracle of not being alone anymore. The morning air felt different to Rebecca Stone as she walked through the colony's central market. Vendors were setting up their stalls, selling fresh vegetables and homemade goods to early shoppers. Everything looked normal, but Rebecca could not shake the feeling that something important was happening right under her nose. As colony leader, Rebecca had learned to pay attention to small changes in routine. People talked differently when they were hiding something. They avoided eye contact or became too friendly too quickly. Over the past month, she had noticed several colonists acting strangely, but she could not figure out what they were hiding. The mystery centered around David Miller, the quiet barber who had lived in the colony for 3 years. David had always been reliable and predictable. He opened his shop at the same time every day, served his customers with polite efficiency, and closed at sunset. Recently, though, people had started commenting on changes in his behavior. "He seems happier," Mrs. Patterson had mentioned during a town council meeting. "More at peace with himself. Sings while he works now," added Farmer Johnson. "Never used to do that before." These seemed like positive changes, but Rebecca had learned that any change in a small community could signal bigger problems. She decided to investigate, not because she suspected David of wrongdoing, but because understanding her people was part of her job. Rebecca started by asking casual questions around the colony. She learned that David still took his evening walks outside the walls, just as he had for months. But now he stayed out much longer, sometimes not returning until near midnight. The guards had noticed but said nothing because David never caused trouble. "Where does he go?" Rebecca asked Guard Wilson one afternoon. "Same place as always," Wilson replied. "That big field about 10 minutes walk from the gate. He just sits there for hours. Peaceful fellow, never bothers anyone. What does he do out there?" Wilson shrugged. "Sits and thinks, I suppose. Maybe looks at the stars. We all need quiet time." Rebecca decided she needed to see for herself what David was doing during these long evening visits to the field. Days later, As the twin suns began to set, she followed him at a careful distance. David walked his usual route through the gate and across the grassland. Rebecca stayed far behind, using small hills and clusters of trees to hide her approach. She felt foolish for spying on one of her own colonists, but her curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. When David reached his destination and sat down on the old tree stump, Rebecca positioned herself behind a low ridge where she could observe, without being seen. She expected to watch David sit quietly for a few minutes before heading home. Instead, she witnessed something that made her question her own eyesight. David began to sing, his voice carrying clearly across the empty field. That by itself was not surprising. Many people sang when they thought they were alone. But as David continued his melody, a sound answered him from the darkness beyond the field's edge. A deep, rumbling sound that was definitely not human. Rebecca's first thought was that some kind of large animal had wandered too close to the colony. Her second thought was to call for the guards, but before she could move, a shape emerged from the shadows that made her forget how to breathe. The creature was enormous, easily the size of a small building. It moved with surprising grace for something so massive, approaching David with slow, careful steps. In the moonlight, Rebecca could see scales that reflected light like mirrors and wings folded against a body longer than 3 houses placed end to end. A dragon. An actual dragon. The kind that existed only in old stories and historical records. Rebecca had seen pictures in museums, read about them in xenobiology textbooks. But those sources all agreed that dragons had been extinct for over 1,000 years. Yet here one stood, close enough to David that it could have killed him with a single breath. Instead of attacking, the creature lowered its massive head until it was level with the human sitting calmly on his stump. "Good evening, Cyrith," David said, as if greeting an old friend. "Good evening, David," the dragon replied in perfect universal language. Rebecca watched in stunned silence as human and dragon began what was clearly a familiar routine. David sang a melody, and the dragon joined in with harmonies that made the ground vibrate beneath Rebecca's feet. Their voices blended together in a way that should have been impossible, creating music unlike anything she had ever heard. The songs continued for over an hour. Some were clearly human in origin, simple and emotional. Others sounded ancient and complex, probably dragon music adapted for David's more limited vocal range. But all of them were beautiful, and all of them spoke of genuine friendship between 2 beings who should have been natural enemies. When the singing finally ended, David and the dragon talked quietly. Rebecca could not hear their words, but she could see their body language. David gestured animatedly while telling some story. The dragon listened with obvious interest, occasionally making sounds that might have been laughter. They behaved like old friends catching up after a long day apart. Rebecca remained hidden until David finally said goodbye and began walking back toward the colony. The dragon watched him leave, then disappeared into the darkness with barely a sound despite its enormous size. Rebecca waited another 10 minutes before carefully making her own way home. Her mind raced with implications as she walked through the quiet streets. Dragons were not just extinct animals. They were intelligent beings with advanced technology, beings that had once ruled entire star systems. Their scales could power starships, their knowledge could unlock scientific secrets, their very existence could reshape humanity's understanding of the galaxy. The next morning, Rebecca called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. Dr. Patricia Wong, the colony's xenobiologist, nearly fainted when Rebecca described what she had seen. "Impossible," Dr. Wong whispered. "Star dragons were hunted to extinction by the old empire. The last confirmed sighting was over 800 years ago." "I know what I saw," Rebecca insisted, "and I think it's been going on for weeks, maybe months." Dr. Wong pulled up files on her computer, showing Rebecca historical records and scientific studies. "If you're right, if there really is a living dragon on this world, the implications are staggering. The Galactic Empire would pay billions for access to dragon technology. The scientific community would consider this the discovery of the century." Rebecca felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. What would happen to the dragon? It would Be studied, of course. Kept in a research facility where scientists could learn from it. Dragon knowledge could advance human technology by thousands of years. What about David? Dr. Wong looked confused. What about him? He's obviously formed some kind of relationship with this creature. They're friends. Friendship with a dragon is impossible, Dr. Wong said dismissively. Dragons are highly intelligent, but they're also incredibly dangerous. This David person is probably being manipulated or controlled somehow. The dragon is using him for its own purposes. Rebecca thought about what she had witnessed in the field, the careful way the dragon had moved around David, the obvious affection in their voices, the collaborative nature of their music making. It had not looked like manipulation to her. It had looked like genuine friendship, but Rebecca also knew her responsibilities to the colony and to humanity as a whole. If there was really a dragon living in their region, the authorities needed to be informed. The potential benefits to human civilization were too important to ignore. That evening, Rebecca sent a coded message to the Galactic Empire's regional headquarters. She reported the presence of what appeared to be a surviving star dragon on Haven's Rest, along with coordinates and observational data. She requested guidance on how to proceed. The response came back within hours. Imperial ships would arrive within the week to investigate and, if the report was confirmed, to secure the dragon for scientific study. Rebecca stared at the message and wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Somewhere out in the field beyond the colony walls, David was probably singing with his friend, completely unaware that their peaceful evenings together were about to come to an end. Ships appeared in the sky above Haven's Rest like dark clouds gathering before a storm. David stood in his barbershop doorway, watching the Imperial vessels take positions around the colony. Their hulls were black metal that seemed to absorb light, and their weapons were clearly visible even from the ground. David's hand shook as he closed his shop early and walked toward the colony center. Word had spread quickly through the streets. Everyone knew why the Empire had come. Someone had reported Sireth's presence, and now she would be taken away to become a specimen in some distant laboratory. The thought made David feel sick. Over the past 2 months, Sireth had become more than a friend. She was family, the sister he had never had, the connection to something larger than himself that he had always sought. The idea of losing her was unbearable. Rebecca Stone stood in the town square, surrounded by Imperial officers in crisp uniforms. She looked pale and tired, like she had not slept in days. When she saw David approaching, guilt flickered across her face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I had to report it. The potential benefits to humanity were too important to ignore." David stared at her for a long moment. "Did you ask her permission before you decided to hand her over to be experimented on? Dragons are dangerous, David. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly," David replied. "I understand that Sireth is the kindest, most gentle being I've ever met. I understand that she's been alone for over 1,000 years because people like you decided she was too dangerous to exist." Before Rebecca could respond, one of the Imperial officers stepped forward. Commander Hayes was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a voice like metal scraping against stone. "You're David Miller, the individual who has been in contact with the dragon," Commander Hayes said. It was not a question. "Yes. You will guide us to its location immediately. Any attempt to warn the creature or interfere with our operation will result in your arrest." David looked around the town square at faces he had known for 3 years. Some people watched with excitement, probably thinking about the wealth and technology the dragon might bring. Others looked worried, perhaps beginning to understand what their decision would cost. "What if I refuse?" David asked. Commander Hayes smiled without warmth. "Then we will find it ourselves and assume it has corrupted your mind. Dragons are known to be manipulative. Any resistance on your part will be treated as evidence of mental influence." David realized he had no choice. If he refused to cooperate, they would hunt Sireth anyway, and they would do it believing she was some kind of monster who had brainwashed him. At least if he went along, he might be able to protect her somehow. "I'll take you to her," David said, but I want to talk to her first. Alone. Commander Hayes considered this. You have 5 minutes to convince it to surrender peacefully. If you try to help it escape, my soldiers have orders to shoot. As the sun set, David led a small army of Imperial soldiers across the field where he and Cyrith had shared so many peaceful evenings. The soldiers carried weapons designed specifically for hunting dragons, energy nets, and sonic disruptors that could bring down even the mightiest star dragon. David's heart broke as he walked. Tomorrow there would be no more singing in this field. No more conversations about ancient history and human culture. No more gentle giant listening patiently while he told stories about his barbershop customers. Cyrith would be gone, and David would be alone again. They reached the center of the field as the first stars appeared overhead. David sat on his familiar stump and began to sing, but his voice cracked with emotion. The melody was one of Cyrith's favorites, a lullaby about coming home after a long journey. Cyrith appeared within minutes, approaching from her usual direction with her usual careful grace. But as she drew closer, David could see that she knew something was wrong. Her ancient eyes took in the soldiers hiding in the grass, the weapons trained on her from multiple angles, the Imperial ships hovering overhead. "Hello, David," she said, calmly, settling into her customary position. "I see our evenings together have come to an end." "I'm sorry," David whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. They found out about us, and now they want to take you away." Cyrith looked at the soldiers surrounding them, then back at David. "You could have warned me. You could have told me to run." "They said they'd hunt you anyway. At least this way, maybe I can help somehow." "Oh, my dear friend," Cyrith said softly. "You have helped more than you will ever know." Commander Hayes stepped out of the shadows with his weapons squad behind him. "Dragon," he called out in a voice meant to carry authority, "you are surrounded. Surrender immediately and you will not be harmed." Cyrith lifted her great head and looked at the commander with eyes that held centuries of wisdom and pain. "And if I surrender, what then? A cage? Experiments? Vivisection to discover the secrets of dragon biology? You will be studied, yes. The knowledge we gain could benefit all of humanity." "As my family was studied?" Cyrith asked. "As my maid and daughter were dissected for the greater good?" Commander Hayes looked uncomfortable but did not back down. "That was different. The old empire had crude methods. Modern science is more humane." Cyrith laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling through mountains. Humane. What an interesting word to choose. She turned to David and her voice became gentle again. "My friend, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my very long life. You gave me something I thought was lost forever. You gave me music." "Don't say goodbye," David pleaded. "This isn't over. I'll find a way to help you." "There is no help for what comes next," Cyrith said. "But there is something I can give you first. Something I should have given you weeks ago." Cyrith lifted her voice and began to sing. Not one of the songs David had taught her, not one of the ancient dragon melodies she had shared with him, but something entirely new. It was a song that blended human and dragon musical traditions, simple enough for human voices but complex enough to carry the weight of 1,000 years of loneliness and joy. As her voice soared across the field, something unexpected happened. Other voices joined in. The soldiers, who had come prepared for violence, found themselves listening to the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Some of them began to hum, along unconsciously. David added his voice to Cyrith's, harmonizing with the melody as he had learned to do over their many evenings together. Then from the direction of the colony, other voices began to join them. Colonists had followed the soldiers to see what would happen, and now they stood at the field's edge, drawn by music that spoke to something deep in the human soul. Rebecca Stone was among them, tears running down her face as she realized what she had set in motion. Dr. Wong stood beside her, staring in wonder at the impossible sight of humans and a dragon making music together. The song grew as more voices joined. Guards from the colony walls, farmers from the outlying settlements, children who had snuck out of their homes to see the dragon. Even some of the Imperial soldiers found themselves singing, their weapons forgotten in the face of something more powerful than any technology. When the song finally ended, the field was silent except for the sound of hundreds of people quietly crying. Commander Hayes looked around at his soldiers, many of whom were staring at Cyrith with wonder instead of fear. "That was beautiful," one of the younger soldiers whispered. "Secure the target," Commander Hayes ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. As the energy nets began to activate, Cyrith looked one last time at David. "Thank you for showing me that music is not lost from this galaxy. As long as humans can sing, as long as they can choose friendship over fear, there is hope." But before the nets could fully deploy, Rebecca Stone stepped forward. "Wait," she called out. "Commander Hayes, I formally withdraw my report. There is no dragon here." The commander stared at her. "What are you talking about? It's right there." "I see a friend," Rebecca said firmly. "I see someone who has brought more joy to this colony in 2 months than we've known in 3 years. I see someone who deserves to live in peace." "I see her too," added Dr. Wong, stepping up beside Rebecca. "And me," called out Guard Wilson. One by one, the colonists began to speak up. They all claimed to see nothing but David sitting alone in an empty field. The soldiers looked confused, glancing back and forth between their equipment readings and the crowd of humans who insisted there was no dragon present. Commander Hayes activated his own sensors, but something was interfering with his readings. The dragon was right there, clearly visible, but every human in the crowd was denying its existence. "This is absurd," he said. "My instruments clearly show—" "Your instruments are malfunctioning," Rebecca interrupted. "There's nothing here but a man who likes to sing under the stars." As the standoff continued, something beautiful began to happen. The colonists started singing again, the same melody Cyrith had taught them. Their voices rose into the night sky, carrying a message that transcended words. This dragon was not a specimen to be captured. She was family, and families protected each other. Commander Hayes found himself facing an entire human colony united in peaceful defiance. He could have ordered his soldiers to fire, could have taken the dragon by force. But the song had affected his people too. They were looking at him with doubt in their eyes, questioning orders that suddenly seemed cruel and unnecessary. In the Iowa's end, humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their weapons, but their ability to choose compassion over conquest. And on that night, in a field on a distant world, a small colony chose to protect the last dragon in the galaxy, simply because it was the right thing to do. The Imperial ships left Haven's Rest the next morning, their mission officially classified as a false alarm. And every evening thereafter, as the twin suns set behind the mountains, David Miller continued his walks to the field where he and Cyrith sang together under the alien stars, surrounded by a community that had learned the true meaning of harmony.